All right, I'm just figuring out how pixelated the images are going to be, and they're going to be pretty pixelated, so I'm sorry about that. But when Sasha announced the theme for tonight's JFLS as Heartwork, a rather different image from the one we just had on the screen came into my mind. This is what I think of when I think of Heartwork. For me and my work, this really represents what Heartwork was to women who were interested in plants and the natural world in the 18th century, which is what I studied. So I recognize that this is a rather different image. However, I'm going to try and convince you tonight that this represents something like Heartwork. So this piece was made by the English artist Mary Delaney in the late 1770s. And it's a botanically accurate collage, or what she would have called a paper mosaic, of a specimen of dwarf elder which she collected herself. This is made up of hundreds of tiny pieces of paper, which Delaney painted, cut out, and glued onto this painted black background. And I especially want to draw your attention right here, where you can see that there's this sort of leaf shape which is a really different color than all the other ones. That's because all the other ones are made out of painted pieces of paper. That sort of brown leaf there is actually a specimen leaf that she glued onto this image. So it sort of deteriorated at a faster rate than the rest of the piece. In addition to her artwork, Delaney left behind a massive archive of letters, which provide a great deal of insight into her life and work and display her close connections to a circle of women who similarly adored the study of nature. Though I can't make an absolutely certain link between this picture and her correspondence, there's a letter written by Delaney at around the same time that she made this dwarf elder piece, which I think may tell us a little bit about where that leaf comes from, fills in the background of how she collected the plants she represented in her artwork and what they meant to her. So this is from a letter Delaney wrote to her friend Lady Andover, in which she describes a recent journey she had taken with their mutual friend, Margaret Cavendish Bentinck, the Duchess of Portland. She says, "Made the road to Amersham very pleasant. Screams of admiration often interrupted the thread of our discourse. Sometimes a plant that the Linnaeus of Bulstrode had long been in search of, and other vegetable objects that never escaped the piercing eye of a certain female philosopher. But alas, as all human joys are imperfect, notwithstanding expectation and every useful implement for the purpose, not one moth, butterfly, or beetle made its appearance the whole way, and we finished our voyage about 8 o'clock without a prize, save one sprig of dwarf elder, which we brought home in triumph." As I said, because I don't have an exact date for that letter, I can't be totally certain, but I suspect that that little leaf that's on the image that I just showed you a second ago may have been part of that sprig brought home in triumph, and that it was pasted onto Delaney's artwork as a botanical specimen, but also as a memento of a day spent with her best friend, the Duchess. I wanted to introduce these two women, Mary Delaney and the Duchess of Portland, to you tonight through this quote, because I think it gets right to the heart of what I want to talk about, which is the particular relationship expressed by 18th century women who were interested in the natural world between, on the one hand, a deep botanical knowledge and assertion of their own skills as investigators and collectors of the natural world, and on the other hand, a profound emotional sense a profound sense of how what we might call their scientific activities were bound up with their emotional and social lives. Delaney calls her friend the Duchess a philosopher in this quote, what we would now call a natural scientist, and indeed she compares her friend to the taxonomist Carl Linnaeus, probably the most influential natural philosopher of their age. But her praise for her friend's philosophical ability is tied up with the reports of their screams of admiration. There's a palpable, almost uncontainable joy in what they called their botanizing or plant collecting, which is expressed in Delaney's letter and echoed in so many of her reports of the natural history work with the Duchess that she took, the natural history work with the Duchess that she undertook across the decades of their friendship. In these women's reports of their botanical investigations, they constantly reaffirm the connection between the work of natural history, and particularly the work of botany and plant collecting, with the most deeply felt emotions of elation, joy, love, and loss at the center of their lives. So tonight, through some of the remaining traces of these women's affection for one another and for the natural world, principally the art Delaney created and the letters her group of friends left behind, I'd like to introduce you to this circle of female friends in the late 18th century, and argued that Heartwork is actually a perfect way of describing their particular combination of botany, artwork, and emotion. However, I'll back up first and give you a little, very, very brief history of the two women that I'm principally going to be talking about. So this is Mary Delaney. She was born in 1700 and died in 1788. At 18, she was married to a friend of her father's. She did not want to marry him. He was 40 years her senior. He treated her pretty miserably, but he died in 1726, 8 years after their marriage began.
Excellent.
So it was bad, but it ended. She remained a widow for a while before eventually remarrying the love of her life, Patrick Delaney, and they were apparently very happy together until he died in 1768. Various arts and crafts, often called accomplishments in the 18th century, had been the passion of her whole life. And she was well known for her skills in needlework, drawing, cut paper work, which is cutting things out of paper and gluing them to other things, and shell work, which is gluing shells to other things, amongst many others. Following her second widowhood, Delaney began to spend most of her time with her best friend, Margaret Cavendish Bentinck, the Duchess of Portland. The Duchess of Portland was Delaney's junior by 15 years, having been born in 1715. She died before Delaney as well in 1785. From her young adulthood, the Duchess collected art and natural history specimens at a truly prodigious rate, even by the standards of the great collections of her century, and eventually brought together what was probably the largest private museum of the century. We don't know a great deal about her collection today because, unlike many male collectors of her age, her collection was not maintained as a museum after her death, but was sold at auction to provide money for her younger children. The auction catalog for that sale does give us some sense of the truly immense size of her collection as well as of its variety. The sale took 38 days, and the catalog lists 4,156 lots, some of which contain dozens of items. The vast majority of the lots were comprised of natural curiosities, so shells, insects, jewels, fossils, stuffed birds, corals, eggs, dried vegetables, and spirits. But her collection of porcelain, snuff boxes, coins and medals, seals, prints and drawings, paintings, and antiquities were also sold. During her lifetime, the Duchess's collection was housed at her estate at Bulstrode Park, which she developed into a site of collaborative study, knowledge production, and artistic production for some of the leading male natural philosophers of the century, like Daniel Solander and Joseph Banks, and crucially for her own circle of female friends. Official centers of learning, like the universities and the Royal Society, were closed to these women, but at Bulstrode, the Duchess created an environment in which women could freely expand their interests in natural history and in the arts. The Duchess's collection inspired a wide circle of women, including Queen Charlotte and her daughters, and the writer and, quote, Queen of the Blue Stockings, Elizabeth Montagu. But it is Delaney's letters and artwork which provide the most complete record of the particular combination of art, science, and emotion which was cultivated at Bulstrode. Beginning in 1772, when she was 72 years old, and continuing for the next 10 years until her eyesight began to fail, Mary Delaney used Bulstrode and the Duchess's collections of local and foreign plants as models for her series of roughly 1,000 botanically accurate cut paperwork images of plants. So the image that I showed you of the dwarf elder is one of this 1,000. This one here, the Portlandia grandiflora, which was one of the final images she made, and it's of a plant named after her friend the Duchess, is another of this 1,000. Here's the two of them side by side. And again, I'm sorry about the quality of these images, but just to give you a sense of some of the detail in some of these, not only each one of those petals is individually cut out, but each one of those little stripes is cut out, and every single spike that you can see on that cactus is individually cut from a piece of paper with tiny, tiny, tiny little scissors. And finally, there's a bunch more. So this is like not even 1% of the work that she created. Delaney called the technique of painstakingly coloring, cutting, and gluing down the hundreds of pieces of tiny paper it took to build these images paper mosaic, and is generally credited with inventing the technique herself. And I think that they are amazing, and if you want to, yeah, I love this. Yeah, that's what I have to say about that. They're fantastic. Though Delaney was celebrated in her lifetime and since her death for the artistic quality and botanical accuracy of these images, they're equally indebted to the resources and emotion of Delaney's friendship with the Duchess and the collaborative work they pursued together. I really only have time to give you, not much time, to give you one detailed example of how this circle of female friends centered on the Duchess and Mary Delaney collaboratively combined emotion and detailed study of the natural world. So I'll tell you about my absolute favorite, which was when they all became obsessed with moss, lichens, and fungi in the 1770s. They just really, really loved the moss. Got super into it. Through a couple of the letters exchanged between Delaney and her sister and niece, we can appreciate both their interest in exploring and cataloging the natural world immediately around them, and the ways in which the specimens they exchanged as tokens of friendship and reminders of cherished people and places also entered into the collection and became useful as objects of study as well. The Duchess and Delaney had been corresponding with members of Delaney's family about mosses since the 1730s. In a letter from the Duchess to Delaney's sister Anne Granville, written at Bulstrode in 1737, so when she was still a relatively young woman, the Duchess describes using her collection of mosses as a reference to try and identify a specimen sent to her by Anne Granville. Quote, "I have looked all over my collection of moss and can't find any other like yours. That which most resembles it is the small flowering green stone moss and the beard of briar." End quote. Oh, no, sorry, it goes on, I was wrong. But the first is a deeper green and not scarlet, and the other is not near so beautiful as yours. End quote. At moments like these, the Duchess used her collection and knowledge as a point of connection and education between women, and her specimens became the center of a web of knowledge and object exchange. This exchange of natural curiosities between the Duchess and Delaney's family was still ongoing in 1774, when Delaney wrote to her niece, that's Granville's daughter, to thank her for a box of specimens of rocks, fossils, shells, and plants that she had sent to the Duchess, and to request more information about some, quote, brown moss-like substance that was packed into the largest cockle, and a little brassish, copperish, goldish, thread-like stuff adhering to a bit of slate or coal, which has puzzled even Mr. Lightfoot to find out, without you informing us, where they were found, whether on rock or tree or bog. You must be very minute in your account. Nothing less can satisfy such accurate inquirers. The Mr. Lightfoot that's mentioned in that letter was the Duchess's live-in, in-house botanist and chaplain. So he was just hired to be there all the time to answer any question about moss whenever it was needed, and also to perform the religious services around her estate. So these natural curiosities became part of the Duchess's collection, but were more than simply objects acquired and preserved. They are objects of study and gifts exchanged between intimate friends and relatives, which represent those connections. These tiny plants became tokens of affections and remembrances of distant friends and family. These were not exotic plants, but local varieties, and their value was created through their connection to an intimately known place, which was close to the home of a friend or loved person. In a letter by the Duchess to Delaney, who was staying at her niece's home at Ilham in September of 1771, the Duchess expressed her desire for a lichen specimen alongside her intimate local knowledge of her friend's estate and her affection for Delaney. Quote, "I fancy I left the umbilicated lichen at Ilham. Will you be so good as to let me know, for I can't find it, which I am very sorry for. My dear friend, will you be so kind as to get me some more? It grows on the rocks in the caves. Heaven bless you, and all my love, most faithfully and affectionately yours." Specimens of moss and lichens, though tiny, take on tremendous emotional significance in these letters, a significance which is often erased in the descriptions of the collection, which tend to focus more on its overall vast size than the emotional significance of its tiniest objects. Specimens like the moss and lichens, which were organized in the Duchess's collection according to the recent innovation of Linnaean binomial classification, are a testament to the overlapping multiplicity of these women's knowledge about the natural world. In addition to knowing the Linnaean classification of the specimen, the Duchess knew and valued the plant in relation to the specific localities of her social group. The Duchess knew that the specimen was umbilicated lichen, but also that her specimen was even more specifically that particular lichen that grew in an exact location on the land of someone she cared for. This depth and breadth of ways in which the Duchess and her friends understood her collection has frequently been misrepresented. Horace Walpole, one of the Duchess's contemporary collectors, described her collecting as mania, and stated after her death that while the Duchess collected pictures, she did not understand them. That's a quote. Walpole's statements are typical of most descriptions of the Duchess until fairly recently, which describe her collecting in terms of negative emotions like mania, greed, or obsession, and deny her huge range of knowledge in art and natural history. It has only been in the 2000s that a more balanced picture of the Duchess emerged. But the feminist histories of collecting and science, which have done fantastic work, really, really amazing work, reestablishing the Duchess as an important collector and botanist, have tended to deny the emotions that were foundational to her collection in order to reestablish her technical skill and scientific work. So how can we describe an 18th century woman's artistic and scientific work in a way which fully recognizes its status as both technical, highly accomplished, influential, and substantial, and simultaneously as deeply emotional? This is why the term heartwork feels like the type of critical term I've been looking for to capture the mixture of knowledge, craft, and emotion exhibited by women like Delaney and the Duchess in their interactions with the natural world. By looking at these projects as heartwork, we can acknowledge both that they are work and that that work is deeply connected to these women's emotional lives. Thank you very much.